Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 38 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Detroit Red Wings, in which the Sharks have lost 5-3. This is now the 9th straight game that the Sharks have lost, as they're coming close to rivaling the terrible 11-game loss streak that they had to open this season. The fact that they've had two massive loss streaks of this caliber and we're not even halfway through the season is a testament to how poorly this year has gone at this point for the San Jose Sharks. But at the very least, this game felt slightly different from some of the previous losses for the Sharks, especially on this losing streak thus far. If we take a look a couple of games ago against the Edmonton Oilers, the Sharks lost 5-0. I at the very least mentioned that they played decently well in the second and third period to make it slightly more respectable, but at the end of the day, they didn't really have any chance of actually winning that game. In the previous one against the Colorado Avalanche, a 3-1 loss for San Jose, I mentioned how defensively, especially in the absence of Mario Ferraro, they played that game out rather well against a very skilled Colorado team. But the Sharks only managed 11 shots on goal, so still they didn't really have any chance of actually winning that game. Here tonight, it actually ended up differing, because while the Sharks would still come out on the losing end of things, you could very well make the argument, especially at even strength, that the Sharks were the better team here tonight against the Detroit. Something that on a 9-game losing streak you're not exactly going to hang your hat on, but it is still a notable situation here that the Sharks certainly played well enough to win. But their major issue persisted in this game, as has been a major issue for the entirety of this season, and that comes down to their penalty kill. And in the many years that the Sharks have now sort of strung together, in which they have been a non-playoff team, they have been a downright bad team, their penalty kill, for whatever reason, has always been quite good and in the upper half of the league. Here this season, it is the first time in a while where it has taken a massive drop to now be right near the bottom, perhaps due to the departure of players like Nick Bonino and Matt Nieto, or of course more majorly due to the fact that Logan Couture, a big penalty killer for the Sharks, has been injured the entirety of this season. Whatever the case may be, the Sharks penalty kill is simply just not good enough at this point, and it feels as though they give up at least a power play goal every other game at this point. Here tonight against Detroit, it was 2 power play goals against, and that is half of the goals that they ended up scoring on a man net here tonight. And if you look at the 2 goals that the Red Wings scored at even strength, the first of which was a shot that Kähkönen should be able to have 99 times out of 100, and the second one was an unfortunate bounce off of the skate of Kyle Burroughs. But with just slightly better penalty killing, where they only give up a single power play goal here tonight, they at the very least could get into overtime, get a point, and make this a somewhat more interesting game. But instead, the penalty killing continues to just be abysmal for San Jose, and it is the major reason why they did lose this one. As we start off in the first period, it is the Red Wings who strike first from Daniel Sprong. As I mentioned, a power play goal for them, but Zetterlund manages to come back a few minutes later to tie that game up, and it is 1-1 at the end of the first period. In the second, it is JT Compher who gets that goal that Kähkönen definitely would want back to make it 2-1 Red Wings, and in the previous matchup between these two teams, the Red Wings managed to pot 4 goals in the second period, 3 within like a minute of each other, to take the lead 4-0, and force the Sharks to have to tie that one up still in the second period to make it 4-4 at the end of the middle frame. They would not need as many goals to tie this one up, the Sharks, as they only need one from Justin Bailey in the last couple of minutes to make it 2-2 at the end of the second. In the third, this time it is the Sharks who get the go-ahead goal that comes from Barabanov, his 100th point of his career, to make it 3-2 San Jose, and at that point, there wasn't a ton of time left on the clock, and it seemed with how well the Sharks have been playing up to that goal that they might be able to finish this one off with a win. But unfortunately, it is another penalty, it is another power play for the Red Wings, and another power play goal for Detroit that gets them to tie that one up. And then the last 90 seconds, Perron, lucky bounce off of the skate of Burroughs, as I mentioned, and that puts the Red Wings ahead by 1 goal. In the previous matchup, the Sharks did manage to make the comeback anyway. Here tonight, very different effect. The last 90 seconds with the Sharks goaltender pulled was just absolutely disastrous, multiple mistakes, and they never even got remotely close to tying this one up again, and as such, they lost it 5-3. Moving on to the players to talk talk about, we have the top line of Eklund, Hurdle, and Duclair, and it was an extremely hit or miss game for this top line. In the previous one against the Avalanche, they were just downright invisible. Here tonight, they had a few really strong shifts. Hurdle in particular definitely had some strong stick handling and domination in the offensive zone at times, but it wasn't particularly consistent either. It felt as though there were maybe like 5 or 6 shifts where they really looked good, but were otherwise somewhat invisible. When it comes to William Eklund, I thought he indeed participated in those very strong shifts, but in the shifts that he wasn't off, and that has happened thus far this season, he wasn't just sort of not noticeable, but he was actually making a lot of uncharacteristic mistakes, which was slightly disappointing to see. His passing was at times a bit off, and so hopefully he can sort of rebound a bit from this one. It was not a terrible game for him. It was definitely better than the previous one, but maybe not up to his standards either. When it comes to Duclair, he was promoted to this top line at some point in the Colorado game previously. Didn't really do anything in that game, and yet he manages to maintain this lineup spot for probably a lack of a better option from David Quinn's perspective. And I thought Duclair also had a few good shifts, but was likely the weakest link on this line anyhow. When it comes to the second line, we have Granlund, Zetterlund, and Hoffman, probably the most productive line for the San Jose Sharks on the night. In particular, Granlund was perhaps the Sharks' best forward on the night as well, as he set up multiple great chances using his slick stick handling to create space in the neutral and offensive zone, set up Hoffman for multiple grade A opportunities, set up Zetterlund for a couple of grade A opportunities. Zetterlund, of course, even got a goal off of a Mikael Granlund play, and just generally it felt as though Granlund was reading things very well at even strength. From a power play perspective, I do think Granlund somewhat struggled in that area, and on the penalty kill, of course, since the Sharks gave up 2 goals, it's hard to necessarily commend him all that much, but at even strength, where the Sharks were indeed the better team, I thought he was a big part of that. When it comes to Hoffman, offensively, Hoffman was very valuable for San Jose, had a ton of great chances, probably could have had at least a goal or 2, but from a defensive standpoint, the issue with Hoffman's game, as he came advertised to the San Jose Sharks, though hasn't necessarily been the case the entirety of this season, here tonight defensively he definitely struggled. It felt as though it was just a bit too much of a lazy game for Hoffman in his own zone. And then when it comes to Zetterlund, it continues to be the general case for Zetterlund, as has been for much of this entire season. Zetterlund rarely has really bad games. He's usually quite average or pretty good like he was here tonight, but he rarely has those types of games where he's extremely dominant. That is left more so to the Granlunds, to the Hurdles, to the Eklunds, not so much to the Zetterlunds, but of course, he's still scoring, he's still contributing, he's one of the highest goal-scoring players on the San Jose Sharks thus far this season, so it's been a good year for him for sure, and it was a good enough game for him as well. When it comes to the third line, we have Barabanov, Studnicka, and Kunin, and you may be thinking, well, this third line scored a goal, so they must have had a good game. Not really. Obviously, they scored this goal, but from all the time prior to the goal scoring and even the couple of shifts after the goal scoring, they did literally nothing. If you even take a look just at the goal that they did actually get here, this isn't even like something super impressive or exciting from these 3 players. Instead, it is both Studnicka and Kunin heading to the net, really the one area of the game that they do well, and then Barabanov just taking a random shot after an individual effort that just so happens to go in. It's not anything sort of synergistic between them. There's no chemistry. There's no playing off of each other. Instead, it is just 3 individuals who happen to be on the ice and who happen to score a goal. So there really isn't much positive to take out of these 3 players besides the fact that they happened to score a goal here, and they were otherwise definitely the worst line for the San Jose Sharks. In stark contrast, you can actually take a look at the Sharks' 4th line here tonight, as they also were a bottom 6 line that contributed a goal for the San Jose Sharks. But the major difference is that yes, it is Bailey goal, just as it was a Barabanov goal, but the shifts prior to that goal and after that one were still quite good. Filip Zadina, playing against his former team once again here, was absolutely flying around the ice. And while I do think there was perhaps some better decisions he could make, it felt as though at times he was slightly over-eager with making plays, which kind of ended them slightly early. As a 4th liner who's just sort of trying to push the pace in the offensive zone, I thought he did an outstanding job here tonight. Justin Bailey, who has been struggling over the past few games, not playing all that great, gets a goal here tonight, which is definitely nice to see. And Ryan Carpenter, ever since returning to his injury, has been kind of slow to get back to where he was prior prior to missing those games, but here tonight was definitely a strong stepping stone because it was a very good game for him. And so generally, taking a look at the bottom six, the fourth line and the third line both contribute a goal, and yet the difference could not be any bigger with how they actually played this game. Fourth line so much better than the third line. When it comes from a defensive standpoint, we have the top pairing of Ferraro and Emberson. So it turns out, after Ferraro misses the majority of that Avalanche game, there's no long-term injury. There isn't even a short-term injury for him. He's right back in just a couple of days later. And I was somewhat excited to see what would happen if Ferraro was out of the lineup, who would be that number one guy for the San Jose Sharks, but we will not get to see that just yet. Perhaps if Ferraro does get traded at some point, that will become a reality, but not just yet for the San Jose Sharks. And it ends up going well for them because Ferraro plays a very strong game here tonight against Detroit. It just feels as though now that he is paired back with Emberson as he has returned from his injury, he looks a lot more at home. Previously, he was paired with Kyle Burroughs, which just ended up with a lot of defensive zone shifts, a lot of struggling in that area. But with Emberson, things are moving a bit more forward, and Ferraro just seems a lot more sort of unburdened at this point. He was making some very strong offensive plays. There was a play at the blue line where he completely dekes out Patrick Kane, who of course is not known to be the best defensive player, but is an extremely crafty player himself. So it is Ferraro essentially beating him at his own game, and that was quite nice to see. Ferraro also picks up 2 assists, and from a defensive standpoint was also quite good, and so he was perhaps the best defenseman for the San Jose Sharks on the night. When it comes to his defensive partner, Ty Emberson, I do think he was a small step behind Ferraro, mostly not exactly contributing as much offensively as Ferraro was, and from a defensive standpoint, a couple of egregious errors at times in this game, but I would say all in all, still a very good game for Ty Emberson, and the Sharks are definitely happy to have him back from injury, as the defense was not looking particularly good before when he was out. When it comes to the second pairing, we have Thrun and Ruda. Now, Thrun is the player who I do want to talk about a bit at length here. Now, when Ferraro was injured in the previous game against Colorado, Thrun was the player who was had the most responsibility given to him, and he ended up with the defenseman as the most ice time in that particular game. And that is definitely a big vote of confidence from David Quinn. Interestingly enough, David Quinn seems to handle young defensemen much differently than how he handles young forwards. When it comes to these young forwards, it feels as though they're on like an absolute razor's edge. The moment they make even a singular mistake, they just get benched for the rest of the game. When it comes to Henry Thrun, we saw his first couple of games after getting called up. They were not remotely good, and it felt as though he was absolutely destined to be sent back down to the minors as soon as possible, and that even like Marc-Edouard Vlasic might end up getting a lineup spot over him. And yet David Quinn kept him in the lineup and allowed Thrun to sort of build up his confidence. Now, at first, Thrun was still kind of struggling, and it felt as though he was playing in a much more reserved sense after those first couple of games. He was definitely making less egregious errors, but he wasn't exactly helping the team win either. He was just a very steady, like, bottom pairing defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. However, ever since that, well, I can't really say ever since because it's only been a game since then, but with that performance against the Colorado Avalanche where he was given those 25 minutes, he was given that number one penalty killing spot, and he really got to sort of experience a full NHL game where he's given the absolute biggest responsibility. Here tonight, he absolutely looks like he has sort of blossomed into a real NHL player. It's one game, don't want to take any sweeping conclusions out of it, but it was a really, really good game from Thrun. And I loved the aggressiveness offensively, truly showing off that two-way style, because defensively there were still a couple of panic moments, but he was really stepping up in the offensive zone. There was one moment where he makes a very aggressive pinch to keep the puck alive for the San Jose Sharks, something that like 3 games ago Thrun would never even have considered going for. He would have played it safe, he would have backed off, it would have just been a generic 2-on-2 type of rush. But here, he goes for it, it works out, and it was very, very nice to see. So I definitely liked Thrun's performance on the game, and I hope that this can continue moving forward. When it comes to a defensive partner, Ruda, I also thought Ruda was quite solid. From an offensive standpoint, he was definitely trying to make plays happen. He just doesn't exactly have the offensive acumen to help sort of actually push the pace forward. And so a lot of the times he'd put himself in good positions and they would kind of amount to nothing. But I would still say a positive game for Ruda for sure. And then we have the bottom pairing of Burrows and Addison. So interestingly enough, Okhotyuk gets the bench. It feels as though he's played a lot of games in a row, but he gets the night off in favor of Kyle Burrows, who draws back into the lineup after his disastrous -5 night against the Edmonton Oilers. And it was not a very good response. I don't think Burrows was necessarily as bad as he was against Edmonton, but he was not really good either. And the same could be said about his defensive partner, Calen Addison. I will mention at the very least that Addison, as an offensive defenseman, at the very least did a couple of things here tonight that made him look good. He had a very good rush with William Eklund, I believe, in like the early parts of the third period that unfortunately didn't amount to a goal but came very, very close to it. But from a defensive standpoint, Addison wasn't great. But it's a kind of a situation where you remember when Burrows was paired with Ferraro, things didn't go particularly well. Now Burrows is paired with Addison, things didn't go particularly well. So is it a Burrows issue? Is it an Addison issue? Probably some sort of combination of the two. But at the end of the day, it really wasn't that bad. As of course, still the Sharks played pretty solid at even strength. It was just quite noticeably the worst defensive pairing for the Sharks, but I guess not terrible. And then we have the goaltender, Kaapo Kähkönen, who throughout much of this season has looked quite good for the San Jose Sharks, and it seems as though he is really trying to claim the starter spot, but this game is not really going to help him in that effort because he lets in 4 goals, which is obviously never going to be good, but you take a look at the first one, the Sprong one, definitely could have made that save. The Compher one, he absolutely should have been able to make that save. The Perron one, definitely going to be slightly difficult, probably the most difficult save to make on the night, along with the second Perron goal as well, because that was a bit of a bad bounce. But those first 2 goals just can't really let them in at the NHL level, so a bit of a disappointing game for Kähkönen. You could say at the end of the day, sort of, that he was a big reason why the Sharks end up losing it. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, and we'll see if they get to that 10th loss streak, or that 10th loss in a row to have a second 10-game loss streak this season, or if they can finally break out of it. Class dismissed.